and vocational instruction to free black men by combining physical labor with study, what they called manual labor education. And when you think about what manual labor education was, it was never intended to be something like a trade school. But instead, it was a philosophy within higher education that was becoming popular, both as a way of providing access to middling white men, and also to prevent too many white men from becoming too puny from spending too much time inside. In a similar spirit, African Americans embraced the college for its potential to enable people of color to access what they called mental professions, which conveyed a higher status than physical labor. Without that training, they argued, free blacks were trapped in a vicious cycle where they could perform only the least desirable labor that in turn would degrade them by association. An African college, they argued, would allow a fortunate few to escape a life of difficult and degrading work and become clerks, doctors, and lawyers. And then in an incipient, talented sensibility, college advocates believed that those men would lift the race upward by their example. And that philosophy then helps to explain why a community that itself abhors racial segregation chose to create a separate institution. And not surprisingly, when abolitionists revived the college proposal in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the point that would actually spark the most controversy, again, is that creation of a separate institution. So you see, for example, Frederick Douglass in the 1850s proposes to create a separate industrial college. And African Americans, particularly in Boston, write in the time, and they're really frustrated and they're furious about this institution because they believe that it will directly undermine their efforts to desegregate Boston's public schools. All of these events in some ways are related. But in 1831, before most of these public school desegregation campaigns are taking shape, college proponents do not debate about whether they should have a separate or an integrated institution. Instead, they believe that both emancipation and the movement for equal rights in the North depend upon African Americans first gaining access to higher education. It's also important to know that, again, colleges at the time are more exclusive than democratic, and they recognize that they don't have the same kind of Americanizing potential as the public schools. New Haven College proponents genuinely believed was the perfect city to accommodate these varied objectives. Alternating with Hartford as the capital of Connecticut, the town provided the benefits of a large cosmopolitan city and those of a small community linked by family and church. And to my mind, Jocelyn's experience with the AIS actually convinced him that this community would be open to other kinds of avenues to increase access to religious education and opportunity. So they had, I think, and in my mind, they had very good reasons for selecting New Haven. At the time of the college proposal, whites in New Haven and in Connecticut in general are pretty supportive of the idea of universal education or educational opportunity. And New Haven is no exception to this trend. As one visitor observed in 1830, quote, "It is believed that there is no place in the United States where greater facilities are offered for acquiring in every respect a literary education than there is in New Haven." And a decade later, another town booster would offer an even more hyperbolic assessment. And I love this quote on New Haven's dedication to education. "There's no place on the face of the earth," he writes, "where nature and art, religion and science are more beautifully harmonized or exert a more benign influence than in this community, this oasis in New England, the fairest section of the most enlightened nation in the known world." This purportedly progressive and liberal utopia, a number of things are going on. The combination of industrialization, immigration, and also, as we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, the long-term effects of gradual emancipation are convincing many white townspeople that their own social status is in jeopardy. And for those anxieties, they're blaming free blacks. But contrary to those perceptions, if you look at the actual population of New Haven's African-American community at the time, it's not actually increasing, despite all of their concerns about outsiders flooding their otherwise peaceable kingdom. If you look, the absolute number of African Americans and their relative percentage had been declining for over a decade, despite an overall rise in the town's population. They also expressed similar fears about immigrants, and New Haven's immigrant population doesn't really increase until the early 1840s. So one of the questions that occurred to me then is what accounts for this disconnect between people's perceptions of what their life was like and how their community was changing, and what the actual demographics of that population were. And I think that the long-term consequences of gradual emancipation actually have a great deal to do with their perception of how their community is changing. As many of you are familiar, Connecticut begins the gradual emancipation process in 1784, and at that point in time, it begins to steadily erode a lot of the legal and the occupational strictures that had once fixed African Americans' physical, social, and economic mobility. Enslaved men and women have labored in New Haven from the middle of the 17th century, tilling the soil and tending their crops, caring for children, and preparing meals. Outside of the household and off the farm, enslaved blacks in New Haven could be found in nearly every industry, on land and on sea, including fishing, whaling, leather tanning, blacksmithing, rope making, and shipbuilding. Africans and their descendants would work along the waterfront, carting the goods and constructing the ships that connected Connecticut with the rest of the Atlantic world. In the aftermath of the Revolution, like a number of other New England states, Connecticut begins that long process of gradual emancipation. After March 1st, 1784, children who were born into slavery were to be free upon turning 25, and subsequent statutes then lowered that age to 21 and prohibited slaveholders from selling children beyond state lines. As slavery dissipated, Connecticut's free black population began to climb, and by 1810, there were about 6,500 African Americans who lived in the state. Newly free African Americans gravitate towards Connecticut's urban centers, Hartford, New London, and New Haven, in search of employment and also in search of community. And within New Haven, newly freed African Americans traditionally labor in positions that are promising lengthy hours and, for the most part, a dismal wage. Black women are working for the most part as servants and domestics, and African American men are more often laboring out of doors, driving hacks and carting loads, or as seamen on vessels that were going to and from the West Indies. But as African Americans in this state began to rejoice over the disappearance of slavery, Black men of property also mourned the loss of their own civic privileges. In the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, Connecticut's African American freeholders had possessed equal voting privileges. But in 1814, the General Assembly introduces the word white into its definition of freemen. 4 years later, in 1818, Connecticut amends its constitution, and they eliminate the property requirement that's necessary to vote, and simultaneously link suffrage to that concept of white identity. By denying suffrage specifically to African Americans, and also then linking that right to whiteness, Connecticut's General Assembly attempts to mark Black people as distinct and dependent, and in so doing also increase the value of citizenship for white Americans. And to add insult to injury, while the 1814 and 1818 statutes deny African Americans the benefits of citizenship, it doesn't relieve them of its responsibilities. So Connecticut, for example, continues to demand a poll tax from African Americans, even after it disenfranchises them or excludes them from the polls. Within the state, emancipation moves at a process that is slow and uneven. We know that the first statute did not itself free a single person. Instead, it decreed that all Negro or mulatto children within the state would be given their freedom after their 25th birthday. In other words, masters didn't actually have to release anybody until 1809. As the limited nature of this statute suggests, lawmakers at the time were ambivalent about using human bondage to satisfy their labor needs. And consequently, in Connecticut, more than in any other New England state, the emancipation process moves slowly. Connecticut is not emancipated fully until 1848. By 1831, however, most African Americans had transitioned from being enslaved to being free men and women. But in the process, there are a number of different dislocations. So while the town government, for example, could once limit enslaved blacks' movement with curfews, they couldn't put those restrictions on free men. And perhaps most importantly, where the government could prevent slaves from owning property or from toiling on their own accord, free blacks, at least whites argued, out of desperation would accept less for their labor, forcing white working men to depress their own wages to compete. So ultimately, college planners, to my mind, could not have anticipated the perfect storm of factors that were gathering as these dormant anxieties over African American aspiration then collided with the news of Nat Turner's rebellion. Tries to expand education and African American access to education stoked a number of these anxieties about free blacks and about the status of higher education. In 1829, free black Bostonian David Walker releases his appeal to the colored citizens of the world. And in this revolutionary text, he denounces colonization, champions education, and counsels enslaved blacks to use any means at their discretion, including violence, to secure their freedom. A year later, in January 1831, William Lloyd Garrison's radical periodical The Liberator appears in New Haven, and like Walker, Garrison also links black education to the demise of slavery. In The Liberator's first edition, he observes that knowledge is power. A people generally enlightened cannot be enslaved. Thus, while gradual emancipation seemed to be decreasing white power over African American socioeconomic mobility, insurrectionary texts like these exacerbated white fears over the power of education to undermine racial stability. By 1831, the demise of white support for colonization and the radicalization of abolition, as typified by Walker and Garrison, began to erode white tolerance for African American education. Then in September 1831, many white New Haveners' worst fears over emancipation and education were finally confirmed. Local papers and the local imagination inextricably linked these two stories. And so if you look at the actual newspaper coverage, you can see coverage of the proposal for the Acton College directly next to news of Turner's rebellion. The bondsman's rampage in Virginia then showed local New Haveners the consequences of too much black enlightenment. When local whites then responded to the African College proposal, they naturally invoked the lessons of Turner's uprising. And so for a community that was already uneasy about a free black population living, working, and seemingly multiplying in their midst, the shock of Turner's rebellion was too much to withstand. And his last casualty, as I argue, would be the first African college. So I am utterly in awe of the collective knowledge of New Haven that's in this room. I'm happy to take questions. Again, I'm an outsider, so if there's things you can tell me about New Haven, I'm very happy to learn them. And we can open the conversation from there. Similar churches, they're traveling back and forth, they're writing to each other. And so, in that way, when you think about where that idea is coming from, it's important to remember that people in Philadelphia are going to be in conversation with people in Baltimore and in Boston. My gut about why New Haven, I think Simeon Gosselin genuinely believed that New Haven was a progressive place in large part because he had had a fairly positive experience with educating African Americans in town. Back to why Yale's opposition. Yale is a touchy subject in this place. Again, I see not just being the institution, but being the kinds of individuals that would unite in opposition to a proposal like this. So certainly, people are absolutely concerned about the presence of African Americans in town, and what does that mean to have a number of African American students walking, as they put it, certainly in, I can't remember the exact quote, in pride with collegians or something along those lines. But what does it mean to have African Americans with college degrees, right? I think there's also the presence of African Americans in their community and protecting their daughters. Al had mentioned Cornwall, which I don't know if a number of you are familiar with. It takes place in 1824, and it is a wonderful idea for school where they bring in students from really all over the world. And 2 or 3 of the students then become involved with townspeople's daughters, eventually marry and go back to Georgia. And it creates a huge scandal in the town for people who believe that they were supporting a missionary education. Right, and now their daughters are marrying some of the students that are coming in, and then going back to Georgia. And so that idea of miscegenation actually comes up again a number of times in 1831. I dodged your question about Yale a little bit, but I know other people here can probably answer that one better.